Since the original nut was extremely stubborn and I had to pry it out with a precision screwdriver and a hammer, the edges were very slightly damaged. Using an 1/8 inch nut seating file from StewMac, I'll work the slot carefully until it's perfectly square again. The original nut is 132 thousandths, so I'm going to go through my selection of nut blanks and find the closest I have. That would be a 154 thousandths thick bone nut blank, which is going to have to be thicknessed significantly to fit. Over 20 thousandths is a lot to take off. That's why I invented this simple jig for thicknessing nuts. It has a routed recess that's 2 3/4 of an inch long and 166 thousandths deep, with 2 holes in the back so you can easily add and remove shims of varying thicknesses. Half of the nut is exposed over the top of the recess, and then you can use a steel 8-inch sanding beam with coarse grit sandpaper to aggressively sand the nut and remove a lot of material very quickly. It not only saves your hands, but a lot of time as well. It's also great for making bone dust, which can be mixed with superglue to fill low nut slots. I use a razor blade to collect it into a small medicine bottle. Check periodically with calipers and switch to holding the nut in your hand and rubbing it over sandpaper when you're getting close. Leave about 5 to 10 thousandths of leeway for fine tuning. I use a flat sanding beam or a flat bar of tool steel as a sanding surface, and I make sure to sand both faces of the blank. Use a straight edge to verify that both faces are dead flat. Then rely on testing the fit in the actual nut slot, not the calipers, for the final fit. Don't forget to radius the bottom of the blank if the slot is radiused. Use a radius gauge to trace the radius onto the blank and take it down on the spindle sander. With the nut blank fitted to the slot, I mark the sides with a pencil for length and use a flattened pencil on top of the frets to mark the height and radius. With the rough outline of the nut completed, I take it over to the bandsaw and cut it out, then touch it up on the spindle sander. I take it down to just a little above the pencil line. The rough shape is completed, and it's ready to load into the nut slot for string spacing. The first step to spacing is the outside E-strings. I set a 4-inch double square to 4/64 of an inch from the bevel of the fret, then carefully use it as a fence for the nut file for the low E and razor saw for the high E. Double check the spacing, then deepen the slots. The double square does a great job, but it helps to have left the nut a little proud on both sides so you have room to align it. Get both E-strings the exact same distance from the fret bevel on either side. To space the inner 4 strings, first use digital calipers to measure the distance between the inside of the 2 E-strings and write the number down. Then add the diameter of the inner 4 strings together and write that number down as well. In this case, it's 30 thousandths for the A string, 22 thousandths for the D string, 15 thousandths for the G string, and 11 thousandths for the B string, which adds up to 78 thousandths. Then use the A minus B divided by C equals S formula, where A equals the distance between the inside of the 2 outermost strings, B equals the sum diameter of the inner strings, C equals the number of spaces between the strings, and S equals the width of the spaces between the strings. Working the formula out on a calculator, we take 1.418 and subtract 0.78, which gets us 1.34. Then we divide that by 5 and get 0.268, which is what we'll set the digital calipers to. With the calipers locked at that measurement, it functions as a fence. With the jaw tips on the fingerboard, one jaw goes against the previous string, and the other jaw acts as a fence for the nut file, keeping it at the exact spacing necessary to get equal spaces between every string. After cutting a shallow set mark, unlock the calipers, tune the strings up, and measure between the strings to verify that they're the correct distance apart. If the space is a little wider or narrower than it should be, angle your nut file inward or outward while you cut to move the string over slightly, then remeasure. Variations of a few thousandths are inevitable, so don't go too crazy. Get as close as you can, and split the difference if necessary. Then it's time to cut the slots to depth. Be sure that your setup is dialed in with your exact desired neck relief, as that greatly affects the action at the first fret. I set the nut slot depth by hand and eye, but a digital action gauge at the first fret will give you pinpoint accuracy. It has a free-falling probe that rests on top of the string without lowering it, so you can zero the meter out, then press the string down to the fret to find the exact action in thousandths of an inch. The measurements I came to with the neck just about dead straight are 15 thousandths on the 3 bass strings and 9 thousandths on the 3 treble strings. Now mark the edges of the nut a second time. You can take this down on a sander or use a file, getting it close to the line. You also want about 1/3 to 1/2 the diameter of the wound strings sticking up above the slots. If they're buried too deep, they can be prone to binding, which can cause tuning issues. For the plain strings, you want them fully in the slot so they don't pop out when string bending, but no deeper than necessary. That being said, just remember that whatever you remove is gone for good, and strings popping out of the nut slots is a much bigger issue than having the strings buried a little deep. As for actually dialing in the height of the nut, filing the top of the nut while it's in the slot is my preferred method. Just put the strings back on periodically to check your work and make sure you don't go too far. You can also file over the top of the nut with the loosened strings loaded in the nut slots. Aside from the obvious visual advantage, the file will hit the top of the wound strings before you file the nut too low. Similar to rounding the fret ends, the ends of the nut can also be rounded. Get them smooth and comfortable, but remember that overdoing it doesn't look good. Whatever method you use, the finishing touches here simply take a while. There's a lot of back and forth between filing and loading the nut back into the slot to make sure the fit is perfect. It would be nice if there were a shortcut, but you simply have to stick this one out to the end. Once all the fine-tuning is done, you're left with a nut that feels smooth, easy to play, looks great, and will last more than a lifetime. It's such a critical part of the playability of the guitar that it's worth taking the extra time to get everything right. And that concludes this 6-part series. With a compound radius, stainless steel frets, a hand-rubbed shellac finish, vintage staggered tuners, and a hand-cut bone nut, it really doesn't get any better than this. I still need to make a pickguard, wind some pickups, and wire up this guitar, which I'm really excited to get to as soon as I can finish this video. But in the meantime, I'll play it acoustically into my condenser mic, and maybe even add some effects to see if I can get a little teaser trailer of how this is going to sound plugged in. Thank you so much for sticking with me this entire video series. I really hope you've enjoyed watching it as much as I've enjoyed making it, and as always, I'll see you again in the next video.